The system does not collapse when authority is delegated. It collapses when delegation cannot be recalled. Control is not removed. It is displaced. It leaves the center, but not the system. And once it leaves, it does not return in the same form. Nothing appears lost. Every function remains assigned. Every action traceable in theory. The architecture retains the shape of oversight. But recall is not the same as visibility. You can see what has been assigned. You cannot always retrieve it. Delegation begins as efficiency. The center defines intent. The edges execute it. Decision density spreads outward. Tempo increases. Friction disappears. At first, this feels like strength. The core is lighter. The system moves without waiting. Authority exists everywhere it needs to exist. Until it does not. Because delegation, once embedded into structure, becomes dependency. The center no longer performs the functions it has distributed. It supervises them. It audits them. It monitors indicators that represent them. But representation is not possession. The moment authority is handed outward, the ability to reabsorb it begins to degrade. Not immediately, not visibly, gradually. Roles harden, interfaces calcify. Feedback loops narrow. The center stops executing. It starts observing. Control becomes summary. Action becomes report. The structure still allows recall in theory, but the system no longer rehearses it. This is the constraint. Delegation without recall is indistinguishable from control until interruption occurs. And when interruption comes, the center does not regain authority. It discovers it no longer contains it. Authority disperses in layers. First, execution authority. Units act within defined envelopes. Boundaries are clear. Decisions are local. Outcomes flow upward as reports. Deviations are logged. Compliance is measured against predefined tolerances. Then, interpretive authority. Peripheral nodes begin not only to act, but to interpret conditions. They classify signals before the center sees them. They filter noise. They determine relevance. Raw data becomes curated input. The center receives conclusions, not raw conditions. Efficiency improves. Finally, prioritization authority. The edges begin deciding what matters first. Sequencing is no longer centrally imposed. It is locally optimized. The system adapts at the perimeter faster than the core can analyze. Time-sensitive decisions bypass hierarchical delay. Nothing appears broken. The structure remains intact. Dashboards populate. Status updates arrive. Compliance metrics hold steady. Audit trails remain complete. The center believes it remains sovereign because it defines the framework and sets the boundaries of action. But sovereignty exercised only through framework is conditional. When the core stops engaging in execution, interpretation, and prioritization directly, it becomes dependent on the continued alignment of those who do. It becomes reliant on translation layers to understand its own system. Dependency is stable until divergence. Divergence does not begin as rebellion. It begins as adaptation. Local actors encounter constraints the center does not feel. They compensate. They modify thresholds. They adjust sequencing. They reinterpret intent to fit circumstance. They solve problems in ways not explicitly designed. Most of the time, this produces acceptable results. Sometimes it produces superior ones, which reinforces the model. The system learns that distributed judgment works. Performance improves. Confidence in autonomy grows. The core delegates further, encouraged by measurable gains. But distributed judgment also accumulates local memory. It builds patterns the center does not see. It optimizes for pressures invisible from above. Informal norms emerge alongside formal directives. Tacit knowledge concentrates at the edge. The center continues to believe it can retract authority if required. But retraction requires more than declaration. It requires capacity, and capacity decays when unused. The longer delegation persists without rehearsal of recall, the more the center's ability to act directly becomes theoretical. Competence becomes managerial rather than operational. The system begins to rely not only on the obedience of its periphery, but on its competence. Authority shifts from command to expectation. Expectation is not command. Expectation assumes continuity. Interruption does not honor expectation, and interruption is not announced in advance. Interruption enters without asking permission. A condition emerges that was not anticipated within the distributed envelopes. Local optimization no longer aligns with global stability. Interpretive filters begin producing conflicting classifications. Priorities diverge across nodes that were designed to operate semi-independently. Edges act decisively, because that is what they have been structured to do. They respond according to local rules. They escalate within their own chains. They execute corrective measures within their assigned authority. The center observes movement. It issues a recall, not symbolic, direct. Suspend delegated authority. Revert to central command. Await instruction. Cease autonomous prioritization. Route decisions upward. The directive moves outward. But what returns is not obedience. It is latency of compliance. Peripheral actors hesitate, not from defiance, but from uncertainty. Their procedures assume autonomy within boundaries. The recall signal conflicts with ingrained practice. Systems tuned for independent execution require reconfiguration to await centralized instruction. Safeguards designed to prevent paralysis now resist abrupt stoppage. In the time required to reconfigure, action continues. Because stopping requires authority equal to acting. And that authority has been dispersed. The center attempts to intervene directly. It reaches for execution pathways it no longer maintains. Interfaces are unfamiliar. Data streams arrive unfiltered, overwhelming the analytic layer that has grown accustomed to summaries. Decisions that were once routine now require reconstruction of context. The core must relearn what it once performed instinctively. Speed collapses, not because the system is slow, but because the center has lost fluency. Meanwhile, the periphery continues to adapt locally. Some comply partially. Others delay while seeking clarification. Some reinterpret the recall as advisory rather than absolute, because absolute recall contradicts their embedded operating assumptions. Fragmentation emerges, not as rebellion, but as asynchronous adjustment. The system was built for distributed motion. It is not built for sudden convergence. Delegation optimized for flow. Recall demands compression. Compression requires central capacity that has atrophied. The center discovers that reclaiming authority is not an instruction. It is a reconstruction. And reconstruction cannot occur at operational tempo. What follows is not immediate collapse. It is incoherence. Actions continue across the system, but not in alignment. Local nodes pursue stability within their own frames. The center attempts to reassert sequencing. Signals cross, intent blurs. Conflicting priorities compete for limited central attention. Observers see activity everywhere. They mistake it for control. But control requires unity of direction. Unity cannot be restored instantly once distributed autonomy has matured into habit and identity. The center can replace personnel. It can rewrite procedures. It can reissue commands. But it cannot instantly reacquire lived capacity. Skill lost through non-use cannot be regenerated through mandate alone. Delegation has created specialists at the edge and generalists at the core. When recall is demanded, the generalists confront complexity they no longer inhabit daily. The specialists confront directives that disregard the constraints they navigate continuously. Both perceive instability. Both act to correct it from their vantage point. Trust erodes, not as accusation, but as misalignment. Each layer believes it is stabilizing the system. Each layer operates with partial context. The longer incoherence persists, the more the center relies on aggregated metrics to judge performance. It seeks reassurance in dashboards. It looks for indicators that confirm restoration. Metrics smooth over divergence. They average disagreement. They compress distributed variance into coherent summaries. The system appears functional because it has not ceased moving. But motion without convergence is drift. Drift accumulates. Small divergences compound into structural separation. The periphery becomes confident in its independent competence. The center becomes cautious in its attempts to override. Eventually, the center reduces its ambition. Instead of full recall, it negotiates partial reabsorption. Instead of centralized command, it seeks coordination. Instead of direct control, it establishes alignment meetings and clarification cycles. Coordination is not recall. Coordination preserves distributed authority while attempting to harmonize it. The structure remains decentralized in practice, even if central in theory. Delegation has become irreversible, not legally, not procedurally, but functionally. Authority cannot be recalled because it no longer resides where it began. The principle is not that delegation is weakness. It is that delegation without rehearsed recall becomes structural transfer. Every distributed system must choose between two costs. The cost of slowed tempo through constant central engagement, or the cost of degraded recall capacity through prolonged distribution. If the center delegates execution, it must still execute periodically. If it delegates interpretation, it must still interpret raw conditions directly. If it delegates prioritization, it must still sequence without assistance, not to micromanage, to preserve capacity. Recall is not a message. It is a practiced motion. It is the ability to compress authority back into a single locus without paralysis or delay. Without rehearsal, it becomes symbolic. And symbolic authority does not halt distributed action. A system that cannot reclaim its own functions has not delegated. It has relocated sovereignty. Relocation feels efficient while alignment holds. It produces speed and adaptability under expected conditions. But sovereignty that cannot be reclaimed is not sovereignty. It is dependency masked as structure. The question is not whether authority can be assigned outward. The question is whether it can be drawn back inward at speed, under stress, without fragmentation. If the answer is no, then the system is no longer centralized, regardless of its design. Delegation is safe only when recall remains operational. Not declared, operational. A command that cannot be taken back was never fully yours to give.